for coming back for another episode. We are so excited to have a guest returning. You might remember from our October podcast. This is Cyndi Grady, who joined us to talk last time about domestic violence and was really informative. And we're so excited she's joining us here again today. So, Cyndi, why don't you say hi to all of our wonderful listeners?
Hello, and thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm so excited to be with you to share on this topic today.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. We thought of you as like the perfect person to have on for April's podcast for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and we're so happy that you could join us today.
Yes. And Cyndi, maybe give like a little blurb of like why this topic maybe is something that you are going to be able to give us a lot of good information about today.
Okay, sure. Yes, I did work for several years at Denton County Friends of the Family, which is a local nonprofit that serves individuals who've experienced either domestic violence or sexual assault. And in my time there, I worked with many clients as a counselor who had experienced some form of sexual assault or sexual abuse. And that included accompaniment sometimes of people who were survivors who were going to the hospital to have a forensic exam or assisting them with completing paperwork for a protective order or assisting them to court. Or sometimes just, giving a listening ear and being there for them.
Awesome. Well, we're so excited to get into this. We have some great information that Cyndi's going to cover and some stuff that I'm excited to learn more about and just hear your experience on this a little bit more. But I think it would be helpful to start off with really just like looking at some definitions of different terminology that's out there. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Cyndi.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erin. Sexual abuse is usually, there's some confusion sometimes about terminology. Do we say sexual abuse? Do we say sexual assault? When do we use one or the other? And so some of these terms are kind of have legal basis to them as far as what will be considered the definition in court or such. But generally, sexual abuse is used to refer to sexual misconduct committed against a minor, no matter what the age of the abuser is. So whether the abuser is another child or an adult, if it's committed against a minor, it's usually called sexual abuse. And this can be any type of sexual contact between a minor and an abuser. Sexual assault is usually the term that's used if we're referring to sexual misconduct that's committed against an adult or somebody who's 18 or over. And sexual assault is kind of an umbrella term that includes many different acts. So, sometimes people think sexual assault is like just another word for rape, but sexual assault is more of an umbrella term that includes rape as well as other sexual misconduct. And sexual assault is often used to refer to an isolated act, such as a single incident, but it can also be used. It's something that people can experience multiple times by the same perpetrator or by different perpetrators. It's a broad legal term that can refer to many things, including just touching, even with clothes on, touching can be considered sexual assault, all the way up to forcible rape. Rape itself involves penetration without consent. In Texas, the age of consent for sexual behavior is 17. That varies from state to state, but in Texas, it's 17. So any sexual contact with a minor under 17 in the state of Texas is always considered to be without consent. Sexual harassment is another term that we often see, and this includes unwelcome advances or requests for sexual behaviors. And it can be verbal or physical harassment. We often see this in terms of workplace situations. Or it could also be on campus. It could be a situation of, instructor versus student or things like that. But it may be innuendo, hints, sexually oriented jokes that make the other person uncomfortable, targeting statements that target a person because of their gender or their sexual orientation. It can be touching in the form of, somebody acting like they're sort of accidentally touching you, but it's really on purpose.
Right.
So lots of things can fall under that category that are not real easily defined.
Yeah.
Even negative comments about some specific group, such as women as a whole, or comments about, specific orientations or gender presentations can be sexual harassment.
So, Cyndi, I have a question with defining these terms, sexual assault and sexual harassment. Why do you think it's so confusing for some victims or survivors to define when they experience this, when they, are going through an experience and they know they feel uncomfortable, but they don't know if this is like that umbrella term or is it something more specific?
Right. I think, sometimes it can be really confusing because the same behavior done under different circumstances can, in one circumstance, somebody touching me in a certain way may be something that I welcome and consent to and that I want. And in another situation, that exact same behavior done to me may be an assault. So I think a lot of times there's confusion around that, like the behavior isn't always an assault. And so identifying it that way in certain circumstances can be difficult. And then I also think that gaslighting can play a role, or, other people trying to convince us, I was just teasing, or I didn't mean it that way. Why did you take it that way? You're the one with a problem if you're getting offended by, something so simple.
Right.
Don't be so sensitive. Things like that. People can kind of gaslight us and try to make excuses. And that causes us to question our own judgment. Oh, well, maybe I am being too sensitive, or, maybe they really didn't mean it that way.
Yeah. Because I know in my work, I've heard on multiple occasions, like the word assault seems too aggressive to use to define their experience.
Sure. And I think that's another good point. There's kind of not a word that's not quite assault, but that covers people's experience, I think. And so you're right. Sometimes people are like, well, I don't really feel assaulted, but it was uncomfortable. I didn't like it. I didn't consent to it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I've heard a lot too of, like, especially people that are in relationships and, maybe they have like consensual wanting sex one time and then the next time it's my partner more so like wanted it or pushed or like just did it. And so it's like that feeling of, well, I did it before, so is this actually, assault this time? And I feel like it is so confusing because then it's like the next time after that, you might willingly and give consent to have sex again. So it's like, I feel like there's such like almost like blurry lines sometimes for people. And then there's always a statement, well, you wanted it. Like you were the one like turned on and stuff. And then it's like, oh wait, was I? Like, it's just so like comments that can be made also are so confusing and make you like question your sanity at some points with that. So
exactly. Yeah. And that's a good point about consent, because agreeing to do something one time doesn't mean that you're agreeing to do it every time for the rest of your life that somebody may want you to do it. Agreeing to do it one time today means that I agree to do it one time today.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean anything beyond that.
Right. Yes. Oh, I love that. That's a great point. Yeah.
Yes. What do you think could help people easily identify or define a sexual assault or a sexual harassment?
Mm-hmm.
Mm. I think a lot of it is going to depend on how the individual feels after it's happened.
Okay.
Do you feel violated? Do you feel, like it was wrong, like somebody did something to you that you didn't want? Do you feel afraid? Do you feel embarrassed? Um, do you feel like there's a loss of trust there?
Mm-hmm.
All of those things. I think I always say we can't, if you're asking who gets to define what somebody's experience is, it's not the person who committed the act against them that gets to decide whether it was an assault or not. The person who was assaulted gets to decide what their experience was.
Right.
And so if it feels like an assault to them, then my viewpoint is to tend to go with that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really great that you just said that and defined that, because a lot of the time it's like, when I know from personal experience and also clinical experience, when you're in that moment where you feel so uncomfortable and your system goes into fight or flight, you're doing anything to just get through the moment. And sometimes you're just frozen, right? And
Right.
unable to really figure out in that moment, is this something I want?
Exactly. And sometimes, it can change even within a moment. You may have thought that you wanted to participate in the activity, but then it becomes uncomfortable. Maybe it's causing pain or just discomfort, or you just decide, no, wait, I don't want to do this after all.
Exactly.
You know, just because you said 5 minutes ago that you wanted to do it doesn't mean that you have to keep doing it if you change your mind. And,
Yes.
so consent, that's another thing about consent. It can be revoked at any time. And the other person needs to respect it and stop the activity once they no longer have the consent.
Right.
Right. Those are great key points to help, I would feel easily define or have that awareness of knowing this is my experience to define and not anyone else's. Because I know also that I've clinical experience of people not knowing and then going in, to their support systems, and some people are like, oh yeah, that's definitely non-consensual, right? Or also well, it started off this way and you were acting X, Y, and Z way, and so there can be that muddled viewpoint or definition of other people's perspective about it. But knowing that you are the sole definer of it is really key.
Right. Yeah. Another thing, Cyndi, I'm wondering if you can kind of touch on, that I've kind of seen come up a lot more, is sexual exploitation, and or distortion, and just curious on if you can give a little rundown on that.
Yes. Sexual exploitation is when a person is profiting in some way, and it may not be financial, but there's some sort of gain for the person from the use of another person's body in a sexual manner. So oftentimes the perpetrator is using their power in a situation, or they're taking advantage of a victim's vulnerable or dependent state. They may give the person drugs or alcohol. They may foster an addiction in the person so that the person has to keep staying with them to continue to get the substance. And then they're using their body in that way. So basically, any type of gain for one person from the use of another person's body sexually is sexual exploitation. Sextortion, on the other hand, is sort of like blackmail. It's the form of if somebody is threatening that, like, if you don't give me money, I'm going to spread these photos of you around the internet. Very often, this person has developed some sort of a relationship with the victim or survivor and has gotten them to provide some videos or photographs that may include nudity or, sexual activity. And then the person who's doing this exploiting will start to make the threats. If you don't send me even more photos, then I'm going to, send the ones that you've already given me to your parents, to your friends, or I'm going to contact your boss, things like that, or I'm going to get you deported, whatever it may be. And they just continue to make these threats so that the person continues to provide the sexually explicit material.
I feel like this is definitely like something that's come up so much, like even in the last couple decades, because the cell phones and social media now. But, even thinking like being a former teacher, like this whole phenomenon of sharing nudes, right? Like is happening in younger and younger individuals. And it's so interesting because I feel like there's not a lot talked about necessarily in terms, and nothing that I can like remember of even like highlighting what that is, right? Like it's such almost like a joke between like younger people, but it's a serious thing that I feel like is taken like fully in context. So it's interesting of why, I think, definitely with having like sexual assault awareness a month, like there's a purpose here because there's like not enough being circulated and talked about. But even thinking about like elements of this are being done at younger and younger ages is just kind of like unfathomable to me. And it's just like something that's laughed at. Like, I don't know. It's just insane to me.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. It's happening younger and younger to children. And of course, they're terrified. They're afraid to tell their parents. They're afraid to tell anybody, and they feel trapped in continuing.
Yes, yes. Another thing that I think maybe talk about is the idea of marital rape. And I feel like just in my kind of experience, it seems like this is something that's not taken as seriously, in terms of like under the kind of sexual assault umbrella almost. And I'm curious, like, one, your thoughts on it, and two, like why it might not be something that's talked about as often, I guess.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think for a lot of people, there may be like a lot of kind of shame and embarrassment around, once again, just like there is in domestic violence, around sort of admitting or saying aloud that their spouse is treating them this way, or identifying it as that. You don't want to believe that about your own spouse. And so, it's hard to even admit that to ourselves, much less to anyone else. And so it exists sort of in this realm of secrecy and shame. It's happening to many people, but everybody thinks it's not happening to anyone else because nobody's talking about it. And there are just sort of the traditional stereotypical ideas about what marriage is, and that, sex is a part of marriage, and that if you enter into marriage, you are by definition entering into a sexual relationship with this person. And there's just historically been, such a power differential a lot of the times in marriage, in heterosexual marriage at least, and religious beliefs have, just also served to enhance this feeling of, if I'm married, then I'm obligated.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. It just makes me think of, like when you watch like movies, like especially there's a lot of like King Henry VIII and like his like numerous wives and all that. It's just like this narrative of, okay, you're married, so the woman, like, no matter her age, whether she's like super young or not, like you're just supposed to like basically let this like older man just have like sex with you, and this is expectation, and it's like
you become a property or an object.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
So like thank you for talking about that, because I do think it's like almost like a taboo topic, like in people that are like married and like sharing of, I don't want to ever have to say or maybe even admit, right? Like my partner, my spouse could quote unquote rape me.
Yep.
Like so.
Right. Yeah, there's so much. And I was very surprised to find that marital rape was only outlawed in the state of Texas in September of 1994. So that is really surprisingly recent
Whoa.
to me. That's less than
Yes.
30 years.
Yes. That
Wow.
is so gnarly and so disheartening.
Mm,
But very glad they got it on board.
Yes.
yes.
Ugh. So after sharing about marital rape and how that's not taken seriously, something else that I think deserves some spotlight on is also drug and alcohol facilitated sexual assault. Because I don't know from your clinical experience, Cyndi, but usually drugs and alcohol is a common theme in the experiences I hear as a therapist.
Yes, I have experienced that also. And I would say for me, in my experience, it's more often alcohol than drugs, but
Yes.
sometimes it is other drugs, and sometimes it's a combination of
Yeah.
alcohol and other drugs.
Hmm.
But yes, drug facilitated sexual assault, just kind of to go with the definition, is it occurs when alcohol and drugs are used to compromise the individual's ability to consent. So this is if somebody is specifically, purposely getting somebody intoxicated with a substance for the intentional purpose of making them incapable of consent, so that the perpetrator can commit a sexual assault.
Okay. So the intent there is to inhibit their ability to consent.
Right. And then there are other cases where like drugs and alcohol are present and consumed, and it's not like somebody sets out to necessarily get the other person drunk or high. They don't like secretly add it to the drink in these type of cases, but still the person, if they're intoxicated, they're not able to consent. Even if you didn't intentionally cause them to be unable to consent, they still can't consent. And any type of sexual activity with them in that intoxicated state is a sexual assault.
Yes, for sure. This reminds me, maybe this is a good segue to the next section, but of the experience of victim blaming, self-blaming when it comes to drugs and alcohol, like the individual maybe drinking too much or blaming themselves that they, got high or had too many drinks, and then them blaming themselves for putting themselves in a compromised state. But in reality, like they don't have control over another person's behavior, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there's this concept of the red zone, which is kind of this term that's been used for the first few months of a new academic year, like the beginning of the fall semester. because sexual assaults tend to spike on college campuses during the months of August through November. And
Wow.
in looking at this, the use of alcohol in particular is seen to be a factor. And it's seeming to be because many, particularly at risk, are first year students. And this is often, it's their first time living in a new environment. They're in new surroundings that are unfamiliar to them. They may not know their way around and be dependent on others to like get them back to their room, or get them back to the dorm if they've gone to a party at somebody's house off campus or something, and they may not kind of have a strong network of people where they're kind of part of a group of people that are looking out for each other, or that they can call on if they need a ride or something. And so
Right.
these reasons are thought to be part of what creates this red zone, as well as the fact that just the beginning of the campus year, of course, on campus, there's not going to be, parties that are including alcohol or drugs, put on by the campus. But a lot of students go to activities where this is happening. And so alcohol is a big factor because perpetrators typically take advantage of people who are intoxicated, even if they didn't give the person the drugs or alcohol. The fact that this person has been drinking or using the drugs, a perpetrator has their eyes open and they're looking for who's vulnerable.
Right. Yep.
And it's never the person's fault, no matter where you are, what you're wearing, who you're with, no matter if you are drinking a lot or using other drugs, you should be able to do that without getting sexually assaulted.
Correct.
It's like sexual assault is not the price you pay for drinking or for going to a party.
Very true. Very true. I'm glad you touched on that, because initially, I know I've heard like countless stories where it's like immediately blaming themselves, or wanting to like practice some self accountability, but it's that victim blaming that it turns into. And it can be really harmful in the healing journey.
Right. And I think part of it is, we generally want to believe that we have some power in our situations, that we have some agency and some ability to have some control over what happens to us. And so I think for a lot of people, it's hard to accept that, I was in a situation where I didn't have any control. There was nothing I could have done differently that would have affected the outcome. And so that's where some of that self-blame comes from, because we want to believe, well, if I could have only done something different, then I could have prevented this. And then that helps us believe that if I just do something different in the future, then I can also make sure nothing bad happens to me again.
Right.
But as you mentioned, it's kind of a misplaced accountability.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot too of like just the narrative or the blaming that comes from like a lot of like religious kind of things and family, and it's like I've heard and seen a lot of people who are in those situations, and because of how their religion kind of like narrates about that, or that how their family like is like, well, you shouldn't have been wearing that, or you're promiscuous or whatever. It's just like thinking about it's hard to overcome, like when you not only are you blaming yourself, but you're hearing outside people and people that probably have a lot of like power and you uphold their opinion very highly are also telling you like you're at fault here. And I don't think that a lot of family members and, you know, religious organizations and really anyone else, friends of people that experience this, understand how impactful and how much hurt is caused by participating in that victim blaming.
Have you ever worked with or experienced someone that didn't know that they were a perpetrator or was confused about like their role in sexual assault?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that I have worked with someone who was a perpetrator who was not aware of that, especially in terms of sexual assault. I've typically worked with the victim or survivor of the assault when it's been a sexual assault situation.
Right. Because I've heard also on, you know, different clinical work and different experiences of like, oh, they just didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
Or they were also under the influence.
Yes.
And
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
And that's, yes, I've heard that type of thing too. And I think that's commonly used like in defense law, you
right.
know, like, well, if you're going to say that the victim wasn't responsible for her actions, then, you know, if the perpetrator was equally impaired, you know, then how can you
Right.
hold him accountable for his actions? And so there's a lot of trickiness there
That sounds tricky.
within the law, within how it goes. But just, you know, when you think of other areas of law too, we do hold people accountable for their actions, even if they're impaired. For instance, you know, DWI.
Exactly.
You don't get to drink or be high and drive a car. If you cause a wreck or you kill people with that, then you are held accountable.
Yep.
Right. Well, that's an excellent point, Cyndi.
Yes.
I don't think that it's thought of to compare like, you know, that to like a DWI kind of situation. But I think that's a really good point.
With touching on victim blaming or like self-blaming, what have you found helpful in working with past clients in working through that?
I think many times what is helpful is just to, for one thing, to believe them and encourage them to believe themselves, to like honor their experience and not try to excuse it away or, you know, minimize it, but to truly honor their experience. And sometimes it can be helpful for a person to imagine if they had a friend who had experienced something similar and their friend was telling them about their experience, how would they feel toward their friend? Would they judge their friend the same way they're judging themselves?
Right.
And
That's
typically people will be like, no, you know, I wouldn't. I would tell her it wasn't her fault. You know, and they would honestly believe it wasn't the other person's fault. And yet it's really hard to give ourselves the same compassion sometimes as we give to others. And so those are things we can work out in counseling too.
That's a great point for sure. Yes. I love bringing that to the table. Like, how would you talk to a loved one? How would you talk to a friend? Like, that's really powerful.
Yes. Because we are always the exception to the rule when we talk to ourselves and beat ourselves up versus how we would respond to someone else that we love and care for in the same exact situation.
So with sexual assaults, how would you describe like the healing journey afterwards and what you've seen in working with clients? And maybe what's like the biggest hurdle to get over?
Okay. I think the biggest hurdle a lot of times is the self-blame
Mm-hmm.
or the experiences of blame that they get from other people. I also think that another hurdle, if the person is not blaming themselves and they are maybe proceeding through a process, whether they filed charges or whether they went through a Title IX process or whatever the case may be, if there's a sense of not getting justice or of the system letting them down, I think that's another really big hurdle that some people face.
Yes, I can only imagine not getting justice from experience like this and how that could really impact feeling validated in your experience.
Yeah, and so many people don't report a sexual assault at all. Only about 20% from what I found, of college students who experience a sexual assault will make any type of a report. And so there can be many different reasons for that too. But once you get that 20% making a report, then it's even a small percentage of those that like ever does the offender get arrested or ever does a case go to court. And then of those that do go to court, there's even a smaller number of times where the perpetrator is actually held accountable in some way. And so, that can be very discouraging to a survivor who has kind of overcome all of these hurdles to push forward and to try to get justice. And a lot of times they're doing it not just for themselves, but they want to make things better for other people.
Exactly.
They're like, I don't want this guy to be out there able to hurt somebody else.
Right.
Or I want other people to to be able to come forward. So I want to kind of set an example and speak out.
Yep.
And so,
Yeah.
In terms of like thinking about maybe even like resources or advice, Cyndi, that you would give to individuals that experience, any of the things that we've been talking about, what would be the top things that you would recommend for them?
First of all, I just recommend believe yourself, honor your experience, and seek out support that you may need. And that may be if you know that you have friends that you can reach out to, if you know that you have family you can reach out to, or if you call us at CAPS and make an appointment and come in so that you can talk these things through. Don't feel like you have to do it alone.
Right.
And then also there are community resources available too. In Denton, there's Denton County Friends of the Family, that is a nonprofit that I mentioned earlier that works with people who have experienced sexual assault. They offer counseling, they offer advocacy, which is where they help you if you are wanting to seek legal or criminal justice actions. And then there are similar agencies in the Dallas and Houston area. And there's RAINN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. They are a national organization that offers support to survivors. And so that's really the main thing that I can say that I would recommend as a starting point is one, trust yourself. And two, reach out for the support that you may need.
Right. Yeah.
You're not alone, and you deserve help, and you deserve support, and you're worth it.
Right.
Yes.
And you're believed, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
thing of like believe people when they come forward about this stuff, because it's not easy to come forward at all.
Mm-mm.
That's right. Yeah. If you are a person who is a friend or family member, a loved one in some way of somebody who's experienced an assault, that's the very first place to start, is just believe them and let them know that you believe them
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
say, I'm here for you. You don't have to be able to fix it for them, but just be there, let them know that you're there for them, you believe them, you care, and give them the phone numbers for these resources.
That is great advice. Yes, believe them. Okay, our quote for the end of this podcast is coming from our fabulous Cyndi Grady. You
Yeah.
are believed.
Yes. I think above all, like, that signifies like the most important things that you've talked about.
Mhm.
Okay, you awesome listeners, we are going to start wrapping up here, but we wanted to just take a quick second to thank our wonderful guest for coming onto this podcast and giving such good information. Cyndi, you're always so great at talking about stuff that's not easy to talk about, and a lot of people kind of stray away from because it's so heavy. Like, it is a lot of heavy content. So we appreciate you always being down for these hard conversations and all the knowledge you bring. So any last thoughts or words from you before we kind of finish up here?
Well, thank you so much, Erin and Ashley, for having me on the podcast today. I've really enjoyed speaking on this topic. And I just want everybody to know that even though sexual assault is a hard thing to think about and a hard thing to talk about, it's so important. And if something happens to you that's sexual assault, it's never your fault. And you do deserve to have help. And please reach out.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, Cyndi.
Yeah.